I, Elizabeth. I, England. Elizabeth, the Queen.
She came out there with her attitude and said, "This is me, this is England. You've got two choices. You can take it or you can take it."
I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman.
You think of her as a goddess. I mean, she's a legend. She's more than just a woman. She presided over a great nation age.
But I have the heart and stomach of a king.
She was cool, she was moderate, she tried to reconcile, and she always managed to slip her way through into success.
And a king of England.
He was an unwanted child, stigmatized as a bastard by her own father, the king, in an age when these things really mattered, who survived to become England's best-loved queen. It's a marvelous story.
Elizabeth I came to the throne in 1559 when she was 25 years old. She ruled England for 44 years, one of the longest reigns in the country's history. Elizabeth I embraced the conflict of being both a monarch and a woman. She perfected the art of diplomacy, learning very early on to thread her way through a tapestry of life filled with intrigue, conspiracy, jealousy, and strife. Her childhood was the key to her life. Her experiences when she was young shaped her into the woman and queen she became, the queen who gave her name to an age, the Elizabethan age. Elizabeth was the daughter of King Henry VIII and his second wife, Anne Boleyn. When he first met Anne, Henry was already married to Catherine of Aragon and had been for the previous 18 years. But Catherine had failed to produce a son and heir, and Henry began to believe that his marriage was cursed by God and that Anne would solve all his problems. Henry and Anne were secretly married when she was nearly 6 months pregnant. Despite all the assurances from the astrologers and the prayers by the clergy, their longed-for son was a girl, christened Elizabeth after Henry's mother. When Elizabeth was 3 months old, she was given her own household, and on a cold mid-December afternoon, she was carried out and taken in procession to the Palace of Hatfield House in Hertfordshire, which was to be her principal residence from then until her accession to the throne. Elizabeth was given a full complement of staff to attend her every need, but under instruction from Anne Boleyn, Mary, her half-sister, was also sent to Hatfield to work as one of Princess Elizabeth's ladies-in-waiting. Mary was humiliated, but she did as she was told.
The battle between Anne Boleyn and Catherine of Aragon was continued in the next generation of their daughters. Certainly, Mary felt that way toward Elizabeth. It would have been impossible for her not to.
Mary was very unhappy and obstinate. There was tension and jealousy between the two sisters. Mary refused to take second place even in travel arrangements. But on the whole, day-to-day life in the household was calm and carefully controlled. All major decisions concerning Elizabeth's welfare were referred to the king: when she should be weaned, what she ate, and how she dressed. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, chose all Elizabeth's clothes, ordering dresses of white damask and green and yellow satin. Over her dresses, she wore velvet coats of black, russet, and orange, and on her head went caps in regal purple satin trimmed with gold. Detail was extremely important, for it was an indication of status. To make matters worse between Elizabeth and Mary, in 1534 a law was passed, declaring that Henry's only lawful heirs were his offspring by Anne. He was undoubtedly thinking of the future sons he would have. But it was not to be, and before long, Elizabeth's life changed dramatically. Anne Boleyn miscarried a boy. For Henry, it was the last straw. Anne knew that she would not be given another chance. Her days as his wife were numbered. A plot was hatched to dispose of her. It is thought the 2-year-old Princess Elizabeth was with her mother at Greenwich Palace when Anne Boleyn was arrested for adultery and treason. She was sent to the Tower. At her trial, Anne was found guilty and sentenced to death. With her mother executed and the marriage dissolved, Elizabeth was declared a bastard like her sister. She was excluded from the succession and kept away from Henry, probably for her own safety.
Throughout her growing up, she was subject to plots and policy. She was a power pawn. When she was 6, she was exhibited naked to the French ambassadors because she was being offered as a bride to one of their kings, and they had to be sure that the child had no blemishes on her. Well, imagine that for a sensitive little girl. So those things all gathered together, I think, to make her intensely secretive, intensely proud, highly intelligent.
Within 2 weeks of Anne's death, Henry married Jane Seymour. She occasionally brought Henry's 2 daughters back to court. As they were now both the king's bastards, the rivalry between Mary and her younger sister subsided. Mary became much nicer to Elizabeth. And at last, the following year in 1537, Jane gave birth to Edward, the long-awaited prince. But Jane died within days of his birth. Elizabeth's childhood up until that point had been a mass of crises and insecurity. At last, in 1543, with Henry's marriage to his 6th wife, Catherine Parr, the royal children were brought to court for much of the year, and Elizabeth, now 10 years old, could feel she had a more settled home, as well as a stepmother who took a real interest in her.
She received an astounding education for a woman for her time, and she was taught the classics and theology and all the studies that all the things her brother Edward was taught, and she became a very erudite and learned young lady. In fact, formidably so. And at one stage she overtook her tutor, and he said, "I teach her words, she teaches me things."
Elizabeth was a precocious child. The king's secretary described her as being as grave as a woman of 40. Even at 8 years old, she knew how to behave in processions and at state ceremonies. She would sew beautiful shirts for her brother and embroider book covers for her stepmother and her father. We don't know how these episodes in King Henry's matrimonial adventures were explained to Elizabeth, but their effect on her was profound. However, her adoration of her father remained constant. Elizabeth was fascinated by his power and wealth. The man who could dethrone the Pope, dissolve the monasteries, change his wife or chief minister at a whim, compose music, and build beautiful palaces. For her, he was no ordinary father.
You never hear her say anything about her mother. It's almost as if she came directly from Henry, like she was partly cloned by him. And she would say, "I'm my father's daughter, you know, I'm a lion's cub."
By 1547, Henry was aging rapidly, and in reality he was very different from the idealized, magnificent, benevolent monarch of his daughter's imagination. Grossly overweight, uncertain of temper, and suffering from life-threatening blood clots in his bad leg, he eventually died.
So she grew up despised, and yet at the same time a center for plots, because everybody thought, well, she's only a wretched girl, but she may be useful as a marriage pawn. And of course some of the smarter ones thought, and if we don't have another prince, she may actually become queen. So the clever ones hedged their bets. So from childhood she knew what it was to be dealing with two-faced people.
When Elizabeth's father, King Henry VIII, died, his son Edward was only 10 years